I'd like to welcome everybody to this discussion of the Book of Mormon. Today we're going to be talking about the translation and the printing and the binding of the Book of Mormon. My name is Andy Hedges. I'm here with my colleagues Kent Jackson, Keith Wilson, and Steve Harper. We all teach in the religious education at Brigham Young University. Kind of set the scene, brethren. We've got Joseph and Emma have moved to Harmony more to escape the persecution in Palmyra area than anything. They really didn't have a chance to do any translating there because so many people were trying to get a hold of the plates that they had obtained. So they're down in Harmony, Pennsylvania, in a little house, just the two of them pretty much, and they finally got some peace and quiet where they can do this. I think it would be helpful to understand. We've got some hints in the Book of Mormon about the language that it was written in, and bottom line, I would say, today we don't know what Reformed Egyptian is, even now.
You know, we wonder if we had the plates today, is there anybody on the planet who could
make heads or tails of them here?
There are lots of smart translators. The evidence that we have about language in the Book of Mormon is quite limited, and therefore it's really difficult to say whether any efforts could be made to translate it. Nephi starts his own record on the small plates by saying, "I make a record in the language of my father." And does that mean the Judite dialect of Hebrew that was spoken in his generation, or is he talking about something else? Which consists of the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians.
Sounds perfectly clear to me.
Sounds perfectly clear to you, but not to me. Later on, Moroni tells us in Mormon chapter 9, beginning in verse 32, "And behold, we have written this record according to our knowledge in the characters which are called among us the Reformed Egyptian." So perhaps, certainly here, and perhaps even in Nephi's discussion, we're talking about characters, and that's a difference. There's a difference between writing system and the language that it represents. So in the characters which are called among us the Reformed Egyptian, being handed down and altered by us according to our manner of speech. And so it sounds like as the language evolved over the centuries, the writing system did as well. Mm-hmm. And so perhaps the Reformed Egyptian of Moroni's time wouldn't even be legible to his predecessors centuries earlier. We just don't know.
So it's a real hybrid. It's just
apparently
a combination.
He does tell us that if the plates had been large enough, they could have written in Hebrew, and then they would have written more clearly. So Hebrew must have been the spoken language, but not the language that was. Of course, that would have evolved as well over 1,000 years.
Ken, I'm by no means a Hebrew scholar, but there are Hebrew scholars who have noted Hebraisms in the book.
Sure.
So syntax is Hebrew, we could say, no matter what the characters are for recording it.
Yeah, there's plenty of evidence of Hebrew in here, including a grammatical formation called cognate accusative. I have dreamed a dream, which is not good standard English. Another example would be the if-and thing. In biblical Hebrew, the equivalent of the English if-then.
A conditional sentence.
A conditional sentence. If this, then this, in Hebrew is if-and. And
a bunch of those that are in the 1830 edition have since been edited to more smooth English.
Right, because it's not good English in subsequent editions to the 1831. Those were smoothed out and replaced, so they make better sense.
But there were 14 of them in the original, in the 1830 edition, before Joseph smoothed it out.
I've read, as much as I can tell, just about everything Joseph Smith ever wrote. He never used that kind of syntax.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's not his.
Well, and this would have been then the language style would have really made a compression factor possible, wouldn't it? I mean, Hebrew to English is, from what I've seen, it's 5, 7, 8 to 1 in terms of its density when you go from one and translate back into English. At least that's the case with the Book of Mormon when you compare the Hebrew version with the English. And
whatever the case is, that the writing system appears to have been developed in order to make the text small enough so that healthy young guy like Joseph Smith could actually carry the metal plates.
Right.
Otherwise, they'd be too big.
That and procuring the plates and all those things would have been an issue as to how large it would
Sure.
have been.
And the pressure was to pack as much information as you could into the least amount of space. That was the pressure they were under, and so they adopt this writing system that allows them to do that.
And I think the bottom line for us on the translation is that this couldn't have been accomplished without the gift and power of God, which is how the prophet describes how it took place.
Exactly. Well, and that leads that. So he's faced here with the text. He's a young man, and he's got a text in front of him that nobody on the planet could read, and he's responsible for translating it. And you can imagine the difficulty, how hard this must have been for him to do it. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of things generated over the years about how Joseph translated the plates. And there's maybe even, we could call it a mythology has developed about the whole thing. Steve, I wonder if you could help kind of cut through the fog a little bit and help us know what we do know and also what we don't know about how the plates were translated.
I'll either cut through the fog or add to it,
Or
you
create
decide. But part of the reason, Andy, for that development of a lore about it, that's what happens when we don't know.
Yes.
And so Joseph Smith in an early church conference was asked by his brother Hiram to explain to the saints how he translated the Book of Mormon. He said, it's not for me to tell them. It's not for them to know. I'm not going to.
Interesting.
In other words, the prophet's on the record at least a dozen times saying, I translated it by the gift and power of God. That's always what he says. The most explicit he ever gets is an 1838 newspaper editorial he writes where he says, I obtained the plates and the Urim and Thummim with them. By the means of the Urim and Thummim, I translated the plates, and this is how the Book of Mormon came to be.
And in Joseph's mind, that's all we need to know,
Right.
apparently.
Now, I'm one of the many who's really interested in the details, the nuts and bolts, the mechanisms of translation. And, there's quite a bit of evidence that's from eyewitnesses. But that itself is a bit misleading to say that. To be an eyewitness of this translation process is interesting, reveals a lot, but nobody could know exactly what's going on except Joseph Smith.
So the eyewitnesses are people who saw Joseph doing
Right.
it, but not saw what Joseph saw.
Yes.
Or felt, or whatever it
Yeah,
was.
maybe in the room, but not actually.
Right.
Yes. And from those eyewitnesses, this is second level evidence, hearsay evidence we might call it. We have Martin Harris, who's gives us some really interesting details. Emma Smith says some fascinating things. Oliver Cowdery, fascinating things. David Whitmer, but I don't know quite what to make of all of them. In other words, we can talk about those details. David Whitmer, for example, will say, one or two characters on the plates turn out to be lots of English words. A couple of others seem to suggest that, but I without Joseph confirming that for me, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that the witnesses knew for sure what he saw. They were probably giving their best sense of what he saw. So I'm grateful for that evidence, but I'm going to leave that lore in a tentative place and trust in Joseph's oft-repeated statement, I did it by the gift and power of God.
All four of those that you mentioned, were they actual scribes in the process at one time or another?
Not so much David Whitmer, but he was in the room, he said. He witnessed the translation, part of the translation, which was finished at his parents' home in Fayette, New York. He witnessed part of it taking place. According to one account from David Whitmer's, there were quite a number of people sometimes in the room. They would start with a prayer, and then Joseph would translate.
Really?
Again, Joseph doesn't tell me that, so David evidently says it, and then it comes out in a newspaper account. And I've been quoted enough in the newspaper to know that I can't necessarily take all that as direct evidence.
Gospel truth.
Excuse me, Keith.
Please.
It's interesting to me that we have appended to the Joseph Smith history and the Pearl of Great Price Oliver Cowdery, who was perhaps a closer eyewitness than many of these others who talked more about it, who just talks with great rejoicing about this. He doesn't tell us the process, but he tells us the effect it had on him. These were days never to be forgotten, to sit under the sound of a voice dictated by the inspiration of heaven, awakened the utmost gratitude of this bosom. Day after day I continued uninterrupted to write from his mouth as he translated. And that's just such an exciting thing, and would that we had been eyewitnesses there, and perhaps we were. We don't know.
You know, Oliver says, too, he confirms Joseph's point about translating through the interpreters. That seems clear. Joseph himself, the means of the Urim and Thummim, which were prepared beforehand, I brought forth the Book of Mormon. And I'd like to say a word about that, about the means. That word is used by the prophet himself, by Book of Mormon prophets. It's attested in Alma 37 when Alma's explaining to Helaman plates and the means the Lord has prepared for bringing them to light. It's explained by Nephi in 1 Nephi, where he's explaining how the Liahona works. By small means, God does these wonderful things. And we see it in Mosiah chapter 8, where Ammon's explaining to Limhi what a seer is. A seer is someone who has means to bring forth marvelous works, otherwise hidden things. And we see it in Doctrine and Covenants 10, verses 1 and verses 4, the means which were prepared by which Joseph could translate. And so I want to emphasize that, to say that the Urim and Thummim, I can't think of anything more interesting than seer stones, than these marvelous instruments that the Lord has provided, through which a seer, I think to me it'd be a paperweight, but a seer can see. And so I want to emphasize that. It's very interesting, but also emphasize that it's but the means. The revelation is the real thing. The text of the Book of Mormon is the marvelous work and a wonder. And the means for providing it to us is really interesting, but we want to characterize it appropriately, I think.
I think so. Not get distracted from the message by the method.
Indeed.
In here. Well, very good. Now we do know more about and have good information on maybe the next. One of the highlights, I guess, of the whole process was that as they were translating, in a couple of places in the Book of Mormon, the ancient prophets indicated that the person who was responsible for translating the plates would be privileged to have some other people see the plates and testify of them and bear witness and kind of back the person up that these plates really were real. And we're not exactly sure when these experiences happen, but on at least on 2 different occasions, different groups of men were able to see things associated with the Book of Mormon. Keith, could you talk about that?
Sure.
Just a bit.
This has always been a point of fascination for me. To think that the Lord would call forth witnesses above and beyond Joseph Smith and the work itself to view these plates. The whole message of the restoration in this Book of Mormon is ridiculed heavily often by our detractors when they look at, well, how convenient. An angel brought the record and an angel took it back, and it no longer exists.
And nobody sees it.
That's right. Very, very nice.
I was asked at a recent meeting of the American Society of Church History, a pointed question was put to me, so where are the plates?
Yeah, they love people love that. Well, the Lord's not, I don't think He's about to prove His reality with physical things to us. The message of the gospel of Jesus Christ is based first on faith, and then He confirms those.
As He says in the Book of Mormon, I will try the faith of my people.
Exactly. And so it was with the plates. There were those that were around the translation process, and during the course of that, they were privy, obviously, to some of the phrases and passages that mentioned 3 people specifically would be called as witnesses. And those passages come in Ether 5, and then again in 2 Nephi 27, and again in 2 Nephi chapter 11. And they're very explicit about the Lord will call forth 3 that shall also witness of these things and shall see these things. And as the translation work came down to a conclusion there late in June 1829, Joseph's mother recorded that 3 kind of emerged and began to actually tease is the word I think that she used there.
Joseph used that word as well. They teased me so much.
Almost incessantly. Well, these were three that had
They
been
were volunteering.
Yeah, that's right. And so the three that emerged were Martin Harris, David Whitmer, and Oliver Cowdery. Now, the prophet Joseph Smith prayed about whether or not they were the three, and he received D&C 17 as a response that's in our current Doctrine and Covenants. And in that, they're taught there that if you have faith, then you'll be able to see that. And a short time later, they kind of came together, prayed, and then this marvelous manifestation is opened up that constitutes in our Book of Mormon, just right at the front, the testimony of the three witnesses.
What was it they saw? I mean, we often talk about, the three witnesses saw the plates, but you refer to that section 17 of the Doctrine and Covenants, and there's more going on than just seeing the plates here, which I think is a significant point.
Go ahead.
I got to find it.
The Lord promises them that if they rely on His Word with full purpose of heart, they will see not only the plates, they'll see the breastplate, they'll see the sword of Laban, they'll see Lehi's marvelous director, the miraculous director, the Liahona as we call it, that led him through the Arabian Peninsula, and they'll see the stones that the Lord touched with His finger when the brother of Jared took them into the mountain. And to me, this signifies not only that Joseph has some plates, plates are written on, the writing is by people who actually existed, and the artifacts, those people that are attested in the book, are laid before the three witnesses by an angel from the presence of God, and then they hear the voice of God declare that the book has been translated correctly and that they need to bear their testimony to it. And evidently he even singles out David Whitmer and says, "Blessed is the Lord and him that keeps His commandments." I'm not sure why.
So the testimony is not just that there were plates, but also of the historicity of the Book of Mormon, because these are artifacts in the story, artifacts mentioned in the book. And it may well be that the witnesses had never read the text. Not all of them were scribes, and perhaps they didn't even understand what those things were in the story when they saw them.
Perhaps
until they read the book.
It's to say that Joseph translated a book which is true. It is historical. And a person can reject the testimony of the witnesses. Most of mankind has, or at least the chunk that's heard about it. But you cannot refute the testimony of the three witnesses.
Explanations I have seen
are silly.
Seem far more miraculous than this.
Absolutely. Yeah, mass hallucination in Manchester, New York.
Right. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
These are very, very powerful and I think indicated, they're underscored within the Book of Mormon itself, that the fact that other people will see these really is going to be a significant thing for the testimony of the book itself.
And the language is very explicit. And especially in the eight witnesses, we did handle it with our hands. We saw the plates. There's very little wiggle room there.
The eight witnesses.
What's the difference between what the three witnesses experienced and the eight witnesses experienced?
Well, I often wondered, just as a one raised in the church, you've got Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, Martin Harris, and then you have this this other group. Is he just kind of trying to gang tackle? And there's very distinctive kinds of, I think, groupings there. The eight witnesses, seems to be, by and large, the Whitmer family, and those that were associated with the Whitmer family.
Hiram Page, for example, is married to Catherine Whitmer.
Right. Brother-in-law.
And it's like this is where the Book of Mormon finally was finished, and the Lord acknowledged those that were providing help and support right there, that knew about this process and weren't deterring it. See, Joseph was chased from one location to another, and finally there was a group, a whole family was willing to kind of back the process. And so in response, they receive also the manifestation and are shown they're allowed to handle the plates. But interestingly is that the eight witnesses and the three witnesses, the experience is quite different. In the three witnesses, sort of the ones that were prophesied and talked about in Scripture in real pronounced ways numerous times, theirs is a much more spiritual experience or spiritual level where they hear the voice of the Lord and the likes. Whereas the 8 witnesses, it's a little bit more like a museum kind of encounter where they're allowed to come in and see those plates.
As the scriptures say, the 3 witnesses will see them by the power of God, and it indicates that it's going to be what we might call a supernatural experience, whereas the other one, with the 8 witnesses, just very much a hands-on, very naturalistic type of thing, strengthening
and
the...
by design, we've got 2 different types of testimonies here, both of which testify to the same truth.
They can be, you can explain them away any way you want. That's a mountain of evidence we've got.
You know what I love about the 3 witnesses, though? Each one of them, in that D&C Revelation, it says, "Lest my prophet Joseph Smith Jr. be destroyed." Each one of them, very ordinary people as we would see them in most respects, seem to fill a crucial void in those early days of the prophet's vulnerabilities. Oliver is kind of the academic that could write a book, or at least transcribe it. Martin Harris, John Gilbert later on says he's the only one. He was the only one with money. He was the only cog of Mormonism in the early days. And David Whitmer was the one that opened his house up when they'd been chased from one location to another. Ordinary people kind of doing really extraordinary things.
Stepping in, and Joseph talks about, if I'm remembering right, how after the experience of the witnesses, he throw himself down on his bed and tells his mom and dad.
Reports that he just is rejoicing after the 3 witnesses have their experience, because it was almost too heavy for him to bear, to be the only witness.
I do feel as though I was relieved of a dreadful burden, which was almost too much for me to endure.
Now let's emphasize before we pass on that these men all dissent from the church. By 1838, all of them are disaffected from the prophet. None of
These
them,
are the 3 witnesses.
3 witnesses, Martin Harris, David Whitmer, and Oliver Cowdery. All of them will, for a lifetime, affirm their testimony of the Book of Mormon. Oliver Cowdery, perhaps best, at least I love his statement as he comes back to the church after a decade on the outside, and he says, Sidney Rigdon didn't write the Book of Mormon. Solomon Spaulding didn't write the Book of Mormon. I wrote the Book of Mormon as it fell from the lips of the prophet Joseph Smith as he translated by the gift and power of God.
And ironically, their apostasy is further testimony of the truth of the event. They'd have every motive in the world to try to change their story.
And if anyone knew whether Joseph Smith was lying or not, it was Oliver Cowdery. He has motive to expose Joseph. If that's the truth, it's not the truth. Joseph Smith translated by the power of God.
It is a powerful addition to the Book of Mormon.
Lord knew what he was doing when he inserted those things.
He did. Now, that's towards the end of the translation, which, if I understand right, we estimate today, maybe the Book of Mormon we have, as we have it today, 60 some odd days of work. And
let's run that down for our viewers right quickly. They start on the 7th day of April, 1829. At May 15th, they're at what's now 3rd Nephi 11. By June 11th, they file for copyright, and by the end of June, they're finished.
So we get about 60 or 65 days.
Working days. Everybody at this table is an author. Anybody could write a book that was 580 some pages in a couple of months.
Piece of cake.
Tell us about the printing and things.
I mean, there's another miracle, is not just the translation in such a quick amount of time, but actually turning it into a book form that you can put on a shelf.
Well, another miracle is that this happened prior to the time of computer technology,
and there are no corrections on the manuscript, no erasures, no editing.
That's no editing on except the insertion of punctuation that took place later on. Well, Joseph Smith works for quite a while to find a printer. Nobody wants to print the book because they know there's a conspiracy against purchasing it, and no printer wants to lose money. When they finally persuade E.B. Grandin to do it, it becomes the biggest project in his shop, obviously. He'd only printed one small book before, and the Book of Mormon is a big book with a lot of baggage and a lot of headaches and a lot of strange things, angels, golden plates, and things like that.
Baptism by fire.
Baptism by fire. He and his crew start working on it, by August or so of 1829?
In through there.
And on the title page it says, Palmyra, printed by E.B. Grandin for the author. So Grandin starts working on it. The title page would be the first thing typeset in the book. By September, Grandin had entered into a partnership with a man named Luther Howard. And Luther Howard was a bookbinder by trade, and he was in charge of the binding of the book. And Grandin oversaw the printing under the direction of his compositor, Gilbert. And Keith knows Gilbert and typesetting.
This was just phenomenal, and we can't get into the depth that it would be fun to do it, but to think of this typesetting, I mean, literally millions of pieces of type they're trying to set in these little trays to do the typesetting, and then the printing. The printing's phenomenal. Do you want to carry that a little?
Well, we're out of time to do much of that,
time.
but it's a big work, and it's a miracle.
Could we call it a marvelous work?
We could call it a
perhaps
marvelous
a wonder.
work,
I mean,
perhaps a wonder.
Every step of the way, that we have the right people at the right time, and the means. You know, when you talked about the means to translate, there were also means provided to accomplish everything in here, provided by the Lord. He had been working on this book for a very long time. He had invested a lot of prophetic time on this book, and you see the Lord continuing to invest in this book as He brings it forth. And the phrase that recurs in the Book of Mormon, a marvelous work and a wonder, I think applies to all sorts of things. Thanks, brethren.
Thank you.